So good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming, for sticking around. My name is Cynthia Peña-Ortiz, and I am the Vice President of BALSA, and I have the pleasure and honor of introducing our Attorney General, TJ Donovan. When I asked him if he had a little bit of information he wanted me to give, right? Because I know no one wants to hear the bios and stuff like that because that comes from Google. So when I asked him, he said he didn't, I could just speak freely. And I think that one of the things that we really want to put out there, or BALSA wants to say, is that we are very thankful to have you here. Some of our members had heard TJ speak before, Mr. Donovan speak before, and wonderful speaker, allied to the cause. So without further ado, Mr. TJ Donovan.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for that kind and short introduction. And as a politician, thank you for not relying on Google to figure out my resume. I really appreciate it. But let me thank the Black Law Students Association for this invitation today. Dean McHenry, good to see you here earlier at lunch. Appreciate you stopping by. And thank you all for being here for an important discussion about the state of justice in this state and in this country. I think we can all agree that the issues of fairness, the issues of equality are at risk in this country right now. And the work that you guys are doing, learning the skills at Vermont Law School are gonna serve you well, it's gonna serve our state well, but it's gonna serve people who would never dare walk into this hall. People who have been marginalized, folks who have been persecuted, folks who don't have a voice. So to the future lawyers out there, I say welcome. We need your help. Graduate and get in the game, because we need you. So I just want to talk a little bit, and I want to open up this for questions, and I said to Natalie Silver and Doug Wemple, who are in my office, who are here with me today, I said, do I really get to talk for an hour? That's a lot. And my friend Bobby Sand knows that I can talk for an hour, but hopefully I won't, and hopefully we can do some questions and answers. I want to acknowledge a good friend of mine, a colleague, a former VLS student, who's doing a tremendous job as a prosecutor in Chittenden County, and that's Sarah George, who's here today. So I grew up in Burlington, and I grew up in a family in the south end of Burlington. I was one of 6 kids. And I grew up in a neighborhood that was middle class, where I worked at the local corner grocery store, which was a community meeting spot. I went to public schools, and I really had a tremendously well-resourced upbringing. Had 2 different parks within probably 4 or 5 blocks of me. Could walk downtown, walk to school, had very good teachers. And looking back, I was incredibly lucky to grow up in a community that provided those sorts of resources. And when I was 18 years old, I got arrested. And I'm still embarrassed about it. I had too much to drink, got into a fight, got arrested, got charged. My father was a lawyer. It was incredibly shameful for me. To this moment, I can remember sitting on the top of our stairs listening to my mother cry about what I had done and the impact it might have on my future. And I went through the criminal justice system, 18 years old. I was just graduated high school. And that was a tremendously difficult experience for me. Had a private lawyer. My parents made me pay for him, but because it was a family friend, I'm sure I didn't pay the full cost and was able to pay on an installment basis. But my future was protected. Walked out without a record, had to do some community service, had to do some alcohol counseling, probably needed to. But my future was protected. And I didn't think much about it. As I said, it was a searing experience for me, but it was a formative experience for me. And I went on to college, and I went on to law school, and my first job out of law school, I was a prosecutor for the city of Philadelphia. I was assistant DA down in Philly. I don't know if many people are familiar with Philadelphia. I didn't know anything about Philadelphia. Great, Philly, Eagles, go Patriots. Go Patriots. Not this time, we'll see. We'll talk Monday. And the most important thing that stood out for me was my identity in Philadelphia. The Philadelphia District Attorney's Office had over 300 lawyers, and Philadelphia was a majority minority city. It's predominantly African American. And the vast majority of prosecutors were white. And I got hired. I'd kind of straightened out in college and law school and did pretty well. And I get hired as an assistant DA, and I was excited. It was a great job. I had a job. I wanted to be a prosecutor. I wanted to be a litigator. I wanted to be in the courtroom. I'm not a guy who, and Sarah knows this, and Natalie knows this, who can sit in my office and read and write all day. I need to be talking with folks. I need to be moving around. And as a baby prosecutor in Philadelphia, you'd go out to the precincts. And that's where they would do preliminary hearings, essentially probable cause hearings on crimes. And one of the places that I had to go to was a place called 17th and Montgomery in North Philadelphia. And I don't know, for those of you who are familiar with Philadelphia, probably know 17th and Montgomery. It's in North Philadelphia. And North Philadelphia is a tough area. It's an incredibly tough area. And the courtroom was essentially a side room in a police precinct. And I used to go up to 17th and Montgomery. And this is a guy who grew up in the south end of Burlington. As I said, parks, schools, jobs, nice homes. And I walked through a neighborhood that I'd never been to, never experienced in my life. No businesses, no yards, no parks, no doctor's offices, no grocery stores. What I saw was trash. What I saw was graffiti. I didn't see any schools. I didn't see any hope. I didn't see any opportunity. And every single day, I would go to this police precinct at 17th and Montgomery. And every single day, as an assistant district attorney, I would prosecute young African-American men for possession of crack cocaine. Every single day. And the significance of that charge, we would call it a PWID charge, PWID, for possession with intent to deliver. And the key to that prosecution was the weight. How much weight did the person have on him? Because if it did, you carried a mandatory minimum in state time. If it didn't, or could you amend it down, you could get it into a misdemeanor charge where you could do county time. But jail was always what was on the table. And nobody wanted to do state time with the mandatory minimums because state time was tough. And every day, as a young prosecutor, not with a lot of discretion, but taking your marching orders, I would take the bus, and I'd walk through this neighborhood. And I've always felt public safety is driven in large part by perception. Do you physically feel safe? Do you feel safe walking down the street? Do you feel safe in your neighborhood? I didn't feel safe. As I said, boarded up buildings, graffiti, blight, no schools, no jobs, none of the community assets that I knew growing up in a pretty sheltered community in Burlington, Vermont. And every single day, I prosecute young African-American men, day in and day out. Same thing over and over. And one day, when I'm walking there, I'm looking around and I'm seeing what I've described. I go into court, and I do the same thing. I finally said to myself, if I grew up here, I might be doing the same thing these guys are doing. We're all products of our environment, and we are all beneficiaries of our environment. And when you take away those opportunities, when you take away those assets, what the safety net has become for so many people is the criminal justice system. And when you add in a dangerous mix of political rhetoric that we've had in this country, that will, frankly, I think we are returning to in this country, demonizing certain people, whether they be immigrants, demonizing people based on the color of their skin, building prisons. And the thing about prisons is this: if you build it, you got to fill it. It's not going to be the white kid from Bayview Street in the south end of Burlington who's going to be at risk, because I'm living proof of that. We weren't rich, we were middle class, but we had social capital. My parents were members of the community. They knew people. I was supposedly a good kid from a good family who made a mistake. Not one parent, whether they were there or not, that argument, that analysis was never made to me as a prosecutor in Philadelphia, that this too is a good kid from a good family. So when we talk about the justice system, we need to expand what we talk about when we talk about justice. We have to talk about the community infrastructure that creates a safe environment community for everybody. Have to talk about access to healthcare. Have to talk about good public schools. We have to talk about quality early childhood education. You gotta talk about affordable housing. You gotta talk about infrastructure of roads and bridges and parks and beaches. You gotta talk about affordable higher education. You gotta talk about jobs. Because you take all that stuff away that frankly doesn't exist, that I didn't see in this community, then you have the system that we have created where African Americans disproportionately are overly represented in our criminal justice system. It's systemic. It has a lot more to do than just the criminal justice system, that we have to recognize it, we have to acknowledge it, and those who hold positions of power and trust in the criminal justice system need to speak out about it. Not just about sentencing, not just about jails, but about opportunity, about hope, about talking about prevention and investments in the community that would truly level the playing field and level out those inequities. That's a justice system. It's more than just the courtroom. It's more than just the police. It's more than just a prosecutor. But redefining what public safety means and what a safe environment community means for everybody in this community. We were talking in my office the other day. Many of you perhaps have heard in the news there was a proposal, although it may not be a proposal, about whether or not Vermont should build a new jail. And whether or not one of the options would be for a private company to build it and lease it back to the state. And whether or not a certain private prison company would do this work. And somebody had done some research and said, you know, when they're looking at potential areas to build, And I want to say that this was, I didn't verify this independently, but I want to say it because I think it proves a point. They're looking at what the dropout rate is in schools. Think about that for a moment. And when you look at who is incarcerated, Bobby Sand knows this, Sarah knows this, whether it's in Vermont or any other state, it's the poor. You walk into any courtroom in this state, and you will see the poor who are overly represented. Increasingly people of color in Vermont, but the poor. And you gotta ask yourself the question, why? Because I can tell you right now, the poor don't have a monopoly on committing crime. So why is it? And part of it, I think, again, is how we choose to enforce and not to enforce. I was at Champlain College, which is up in Burlington in the south end on the hill. Nice area of Burlington. And I was talking to students on a Friday. And I said to them, well, tonight's a Friday. If you're anything like me, some of you may break the law tonight. I won't tell you how or why. I said, but what's your biggest fear? They kind of looked around. I said, what's your biggest fear if you're gonna get in trouble doing something tonight? It's a Friday night. We were all young ones. They kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, I don't know, maybe the RA, campus security. Okay. I said, but why is it if I went 6 blocks north into the old north end of Burlington, and I asked kids who lived there, who weren't in college, but were your same age, who live in the north end, and I said, what's your biggest fear tonight? Immediately it would be the police, of getting arrested. And that plays out in those interactions about our policies play out over a lifetime. Because you get arrested, and you're brought into court, man, then it's all about the wild card. Who's your prosecutor? What life experience does that prosecutor have? Is it gonna be an academic exercise where we're gonna look at a piece of paper without any context, understanding who this person is or where they're from, and say, boy, I found 4 felonies. I'm gonna bring 4. And because I'm gonna look at a criminal record, which I think probably is not any indication of public safety, and I'm happy to have that debate. I think they're misleading in the criminal justice context. I'm gonna ask for bail because this person didn't show up, or the record says they didn't show up for one court proceeding 3 years ago, and therefore they're gonna be a risk of flight, and I'm gonna impose bail on them. How does that play out? I'll tell you very simply how it plays out. That young person is more likely to walk away with a criminal record. Because once you're held on bail, you're gonna do whatever you can to get out. And oftentimes it's nominal bail, a couple $100. Now, a couple $100 may mean one thing to me, and it may mean something entirely different to an 18-year-old kid with no money or no access to resources. And when you plead out, it's very simple. The prosecutor, and I want to be clear, I'm guilty of this. Those 4 felonies, why don't you plead to 1 misdemeanor, and I'll give you credit for time served. It's a great deal. It's a great deal. But that person now is labeled a criminal. Impacts on housing, impacts on education, impacts on employment, and it perpetuates this cycle of poverty. And what it has done is marginalized an entire subset of our population in the name of public safety, and it has not worked. In fact, it's failed. And that's why we need bail reform in this state, because it should not be based on your ability to pay, because that creates 2 separate systems, those with resources and those without resources. And the numbers are clear. Disproportionately hurts people of color. And I always look back at and I'll tell you, this role of a prosecutor, and Sarah knows this, it's an incredibly, and I want to say this to all the law students out here, if you really want to make a difference, be a prosecutor. Anna Saxman's over there saying, be a defense attorney. And being a defense attorney is an honorable profession, but that prosecutor has enormous authority. Enormous authority. A power that is life-changing for folks. That ability to charge or not to charge. And to take that moment of reflection, not to engage in an academic exercise of what are the elements of the crime and how many can I bring, but to look at the full person, to look where they're from, to look where they're going, to hear too that she or he may be a good kid, to believe in second chances, to believe in redemption, to believe in hope, to believe in the future. Prosecutor has that power. Every single day, thousands of decisions in this state are made that have life-altering impacts on people's lives. Quite amazing. Nobody talks about it. Few of us do. So those of you who are thinking about a career in criminal justice, be a prosecutor. Because the change you can make for your community, which is consistent with public safety, is great. But when we talk about the issues of bail reform, it's quite simple. You know, and Sarah knows this. In terms of my professional view and my personal view of the criminal justice system, getting arrested was probably the best thing that ever happened to me, because it gave me insight and empathy. Because when you're in that courtroom and you got a stack of paper, and if you're listening, you're gonna hear those stories. And to those of you who perhaps have made mistakes too, have had some personal failures, I say this: you are qualified to be a prosecutor. Because that's exactly what you're doing. You are sitting in judgment of the human condition. Add in addiction, add in mental illness, add in poverty, and it gets very complicated real quick. And that exercise of restraint, of choosing not to do something, is an act of courage. Increasingly played out across this state. Sarah George does it. I don't know if you followed this, but Sarah went to the legislature and said, I'm trying to do something for the people in my county who are dying. We all know we have an opiate epidemic in this state. And she said, there's a program that seems to work in other places. Let's consider it here. Highly unpopular. Ran the risk of being soft on crime, which is probably the worst thing a prosecutor could be called. But she did it anyways because it was the right thing to do. That's courage. Because the credibility that a prosecutor brings to this argument is unmatched. It's unmatched. Because nobody can talk with the level of certainty and that level of credibility the prosecutor can on the complexities of the criminal justice system. And that is why we need more prosecutors to talk about why we need bail reform. To lower these levels of money that are being imposed. Because the one thing that's changed in this state, but we have more work to do, whether it's years or whether it's money, we're cavalier about time and money. We throw out numbers, 5 to 10 years, $25,000, 3 to 7. I'll suspend 2 of them. And to us, that's exactly what they are, they're numbers. And we have to be more cognizant and more sensitive to what our goal is, which is a safe environment community for all of us. And those that truly pose a risk to our public safety should be incarcerated. I don't have a problem with that. But that's a small percentage. And when you look at the incarcerated population in this state, we've done something amazing in the state of Vermont. We've actually enhanced our public safety. We've lowered our crime rate by 30% over the last 10 years. And we've done it by reducing incarceration by 35%. Folks like Bobby Sand gets credit for that, for being a leader, for talking about creative and innovative approaches about how better address the issues of public safety. You know, in 2007, there was a study saying that the projected incarceration rate in the state of Vermont by 2018 would be 2,700 people. And we're just under 1,700 people. We're 1,000 less than projected. And we did it by a couple of things. By, number one, relying on science, by using evidence-based risk assessment tools to take the arbitrariness out of it. Again, understanding who sits in that prosecutor's chair really holds the key to people's future. Are they going to have empathy? Are they going to see themselves in that person? And more importantly, allow that person to see themselves in that prosecutor. We've done it by building up alternatives, diversion, and other programs. We've done it by creating a pretrial monitoring program. And we've done it by changing the philosophy about what addiction is. That it's not a personal failing, that's a disease that should be treated. We've done it by saying that those that are mentally ill deserve treatment, deserve to see a doctor. Those that suffer from addiction deserve to be treated in the community, not in a jail cell. And when we make this argument, the numbers are on our side. Recidivism rate, and we love to measure outcomes in government. You go up to Montpelier, all you can talk about is outcomes and results-based accountability. I don't even know what that means, but it sounds good. But talk about outcomes in the criminal justice system, you measure it by the recidivism rate. Well, the recidivism rate is over 50%, meaning 5 out of 10 people in jail are back in jail within 3 years. At what cost? $80,000 for a woman, $60,000 for a man. Any other state agency would no longer be in existence if those were their outcomes. Any business would no longer be in business if those were their outcomes. Why is it acceptable? Because it's our criminal justice system. We know why. All you have to do is look who are we incarcerating. So when we talk about these issues, we talk about bail reform, we talk about reducing incarceration, hold the high ground because we have the high ground. Because a safe and vibrant community leaves no one behind. It acknowledges that people are imperfect. It acknowledges that life is complicated. It acknowledges that a system where you have lawyers with no clinical experience in addiction or mental illness should not be the folks making diagnoses at the bar of the court. It acknowledges that a prescription for that illness is not a jail cell. It acknowledges that the starting line to life is not the same for everybody, and should acknowledge that the finish line shouldn't be the same for everybody either. That it does matter what community you grow up in. It does matter the community assets. It does matter the resources. And to acknowledge it is not to condone it. To acknowledge is simply to acknowledge it and to level it out, to truly reduce the inequality that exists in our communities, because they are stark in the criminal justice system, but they exist all around us. That's the challenge. I hope bail reform passes. It's not going to be an end-all, be-all, solve all the problems. But what it's going to do is send the right message. What it's going to do, and I think Bobby and Sarah would acknowledge this, prosecutors are much more attuned to these issues, much more sensitive and precise and strategic about who we're trying to put in jail. And to question, because the numbers support it, to question, is incarceration by itself, does it make us more safe? For some cases, it does. I don't have a problem with that. But you know what the thing about jail is? You're gonna get out of jail. You're gonna get out of jail and you're coming back to our community. When you think about incarceration, our charging document is called an information. And on every piece of paper, every charge in this state, the one constant language is this: against the peace and dignity of the state of Vermont. And when you think about it, when you've committed a crime, the crime is against the state. And it's the state that physically removes somebody and puts them in a cell. Physically removes them and puts them in a cell. I think we have an equal obligation to acknowledge what we always say to folks. Pay your debt to society, we let you back in. That's not true for a lot of folks. We have an obligation to these folks to make sure that they have a successful reentry into our community. We need to invest in housing, transitional housing. We need to invest in job training, vocational training. We need to invest in healthcare where people are getting the treatment they need to address their issues of addiction. And we need to wash away this issue of stigma for those who have been in our criminal justice system. You know, the Dismiss House is a transitional house for prisoners. And in their mission statement, they always talk about this concept of reconciliation. It's a powerful message when you think about it. And I don't know if you've ever talked to folks who've come out of jail. That shame. You know, and I gotta tell you, I felt it. I felt it at 18 years old, of being incredibly ashamed. And perhaps I didn't have the foresight at the time, but certainly my parents did, to worry about my future. And I'm one of the lucky ones. And what we gotta do is make sure that every person, and I'm not talking about the serious stuff, and we know this. The bad guys in this business, that's the easy part of the job. I don't have a problem with that. We do a pretty good job about that in this state. Take care of victims, make sure people truly pose a threat to our public safety. I don't have a problem with that. But the vast majority are gonna be people like me for a lot of different reasons. And man, when I look back at myself at 18 years old, I was pretty screwed up, as I'm sure most 18-year-olds are. But that issue of opportunity, of the preservation of opportunity, has to be the overriding goal of our system. That you can hold people accountable, that we can invest in restorative justice, you can make victims whole, and you can do it without ruining people's future. That is going to enhance our public safety. It's going to give people an opportunity to learn from their mistakes. It's going to give people an opportunity to re-enter society. It's going to give people the opportunity to be productive, law-abiding citizens, to be tax-paying citizens, to be folks who are engaged in their community to make a difference. I just want to close with this one story. About a year or so ago, I got a letter from a guy who was a hockey player. He played in the NHL, Vermont. And I prosecuted him. He too got into a fight. But the difference between my outcome and his outcome was he got a record. And he went on and did great things. Completely redeemed himself, gave back to his community, as a father, married, a community member, doing everything we've asked. Everything we asked. This is 20 years ago. Sent me a letter. Has kids. This was a misdemeanor conviction. He went to go coach his kid's soccer team. Wouldn't let him. Because when he was in college, he got into a drunken fight. And the question I ask is simply this. Are we going to be a state, or are we going to be a community that defines people by their worst moments in their life? Completely unfair standard, in my opinion. And when we think of the criminal justice system, we have to be reminded that we sit in judgment of the human condition. And we are all far from perfect. And that we have to understand that those in positions of power have to understand the responsibility that comes with that power. And what underlies that power, in my opinion, is the belief in the human condition, that people are inherently good. They want to do the right thing. They want to be productive. They want to be part of a community. They want a future. And for that guy who's in this state, it's about being a father and a parent that we're taking away that opportunity. That's not a just system. Those play out in so many different ways in this system. We have to be sensitive to it. We have to be courageous in believing that people can change, believing in goodness of people, and believing that we may be different. We may look different. We may come from different places. But at the end, we all want the same thing. That's to live in a safe and vibrant community, to have opportunity not only for ourselves, but for our children. That's the state I want to live in. That's what we're working towards. Thanks for listening. So I'm happy to take questions, if there are any. I set aside my first goal by not speaking for an hour.
Here we go. Oh.
Yes, back here. One of the most striking things that you said in this lecture was one of the worst things a prosecutor can be called is soft on crime. How do you change the narrative from being soft on crime to being smart on crime?
Yeah.
Because that seems like the biggest obstacle to overcome right now.
It's a great question. And I think the first thing you have to learn about prosecutors, particularly state's attorneys and attorneys general, is we're elected. It is a position that, frankly, not many people know about. And I think that's changing. But I think if you walk down the street and you said to somebody, who's the state's attorney and what's her role, I'm not sure many people could answer that question. And it's incredibly hard when you deal with horrific crimes. You want to do a good job, obviously, on those, and you want to make sure that the victims are made whole and that their voices are heard. And as I said, I think we do in large part on those cases in Vermont, whether they be murder, whether they be sex assault. I think we do a good job on that. I think where you run into this issue of soft on crime, and Sarah and Bobby and anybody else who's been in this position know this, judges know this. Anything bad happens in this community, name the community. And you see the name, I can tell you what we're all gonna do. We're running to our files to make sure, did I have them? What was my last decision? What did I do? Am I responsible? Because you know you're gonna be on the front page of the paper explaining your actions. And what that does is to create a very risk-averse system. Risk-averse in the sense of not giving people, as I like to say, on those jump ball cases that can go either way, where you know in your heart of hearts, you probably want to give this person a break, but you're nervous, and rightfully so, and you don't. And it becomes a very risk-averse system. And look, the easiest thing for a prosecutor to do, ask for bail, ask for jail. There's no downside, you can't lose. And so when you're talking smart on crime, for me what that means is really an investment into science, because it's an incredibly arbitrary system, and I think we're doing that in Vermont, that we're using evidence-based risk assessment tools to inform people, and this goes to bail, it goes to charging decision, frankly, it goes to sentencing, all the intercept points in our system, to inform that decision maker, to give them information about the risk to public safety and perhaps what the underlying needs are. And I think to make the judgments that are informed on science, to make judgments that are formed on more information is a system that's going to be much more smart, much more efficient, and frankly, much more effective. But you are always guarding against the risk of having to explain. Look, we started a program in Chittenden County, Bobby did it down here, where essentially we stopped charging people. And you did it in a way where you created a universe of people or crimes. And for me, why we started it was because what we were doing in the business, and I grew up in Burlington, as I said, and one of the benefits of growing up in that community was this. Most of the folks that I saw in the courthouse, I knew from growing up. And I knew this, they weren't bad people. They're not bad people. What I knew with the power of hindsight, that probably I knew growing up that I couldn't articulate, was a lot of obstacles, a lot of barriers in their life. And I can go down a litany of folks who I was no better, I just had more opportunity. And so we created this program where we would use science, we'd use a screening tool. We would divert them from the courtroom, and we'd link them with the appropriate social service agency. We'd get them the help they needed, whether it was for the underlying addiction or mental health issues or whatever it was. We'd have releases signed, and we would do check-ins, because you have to have compliance. And I can tell you, starting off, I was petrified, because all you needed was one person to do something bad. Program's gone and your job might be gone. And so that's the reality of the world we live in. That's the reality that, frankly, judges are in when they're asked to make these tough calls. And I think we have to acknowledge that. So when we talk about being smart on crime, for me, it really is the utilization of those scientific tools to better inform us of that risk, of that danger. So we're making informed decisions about public safety. It's a hard call, though. Now I can say this, Sarah's continued the program. Program works. Because, as I said, when you look at the tools in the criminal justice system, they're actually quite limited, right? You can ask somebody to pay a fine that they don't have any money to pay. You can ask somebody to be on probation and to satisfy conditions that, frankly, half of us wouldn't satisfy. Or we're gonna put them in jail, and they're gonna get out of jail. So what are we gonna do to address the underlying root cause of this behavior? and to acknowledge that folks in the community, folks in healthcare are better equipped, more knowledgeable, frankly going to be more successful to deal with these folks. And if we're being really honest, that the population today in our criminal justice system is going to be the population tomorrow in the emergency rooms across this state, that we have to put political correctness to the side and say, if we're a safe community, is somebody who is healthy, somebody who's stable, somebody who's housed, and somebody who's gainfully employed. Just convicting people for the sake of conviction does nothing to accomplish that goal. It's about the investments in healthcare, it's about the investments in the community, and for me, that's about being smart on crime, but you gotta guard against the risk. It's hard.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question about a set of victims that we don't often talk about in the system, which are the families of the incarcerated.
Yeah.
Because what we are asking them to do is giving up perhaps an income, a source of childcare, and then a burden is put on those families. And what can Vermont do you think, to help support those victims that we don't often talk about or see?
You know, it's a great question. You know, to look at it through a child's eyes of having a parent incarcerated, and you look at, and I know we were just talking about this, these adverse childhood experiences, which I'm a believer of, and to know that for a lot of these folks, and if you trace back the arc of a lot of these people's lives, this is not to excuse personal responsibility, but these are some tough circumstances people are coming out of. And I wasn't a believer in it. My wife is a mental health counselor, and she would keep telling me, I need to read about this stuff. And I would say, well, I was one of 6 kids in an Irish Catholic family. We know dysfunction, which we do, but just not to this degree. And in educating myself on these adverse childhood experiences, speaking with a fellow who said the stress is so great in these homes. And think about this. Lifelong impacts based on the environment you're in your first 3 to 4 years of life. The guy said, you know, when you're in these homes where you don't know if you're going to get fed, there's going to be food, where you may see your mom get beaten, where mom may be passed out high. The stress is so great, it's toxic. And that toxic stress impacts, so you have higher rates of addiction, higher rates of mental illness, actually lower life expectancy. Quite amazing when you think about it. And I think a factor included in that is incarceration of a parent. And so I don't have an answer other than we have to acknowledge it. And we have to, you know, the saddest thing for me, you know, as I said, growing up in Burlington, I knew a lot of the folks. And we used to say, you know, first family of crimes, generational. Generational. They're not bad people, but think about that. And I think those of us in positions of power, you guys, because you guys are going to be the next generation of leaders, we have to question the conventional wisdom. At the very least, we have to question what we're doing because we're not getting it right. And when you have 3 generations of family involved in the criminal justice system, something's off. And it's not because they're bad people or they're criminals. I don't believe anybody's born a criminal. And so it goes back, I think, to what I said earlier. We're all products of our environment. We're all products of how we were brought up. And I think we need people, and Sarah's done it, Bobby's done it, from again, these positions of public safety to talk about what a vibrant community and a safe community looks like. It does look like access to healthcare. It does look like affordable early childhood education. It does look like well-funded public schools running for a school board seat where we have access to robust mental health counseling, not just for kids, for the entire family. Trauma, one of my goals, I don't know if we'll ever get there. I would love, we had this conversation in my office the other day, I would love for us to be a trauma-informed system, to actually have insight. Because here's the reality, guys. If you walk into the courtroom, and I'm thinking Chittenden County, you're gonna see people like me and Sarah George. And probably pretty similar backgrounds. Little degrees of difference. We get a worldview. We get a worldview. And we have to challenge that worldview and acknowledge really the privileges that we've had. I'm no better than a lot of the folks who are sitting in jail cells from Burlington, Vermont. Went to the same schools as them. I just happen to have a lot of different opportunities. And I just happen to have some resources where my future was protected. And that is the key to leveling out these disparities. And we got to acknowledge it.
TJ, thank you for your comments and for your leadership. It is extraordinary to hear a state's chief law enforcement officer saying the things that you are saying, and we are extraordinarily fortunate to have you where you are. Can you comment about leadership at the county and state level in light of a changed federal climate as it relates to justice reform and the broader issues that you've been discussing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we can all agree we made tremendous progress in the criminal justice system in the last decade. I think there was universal acknowledgement that the war on drugs was a failure. I think there was universal acknowledgement that people of color are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system. I think you had scholars like Michelle Anderson certainly raise awareness about the inequities that exist in the criminal justice system, then continue to attach to people and that further marginalization of folks. I thought we were making progress. And then January 20th happened. And we've had a complete rollback of a lot of the gains. Or I should say we've had a complete attempt to roll back a lot of the gains we've made in this system. Whether it's been in criminal justice or whether it's been in civil rights or whether it's been environmental protection and a whole host of other things. And I think what you're seeing, frankly, from attorneys generals is a real effort, and it's very partisan. It's very partisan. But you have a coalition of about 17 or 18 Democratic attorney generals suing the federal government at an unprecedented rate, but doing it in an effort to protect the environment, to protect people of color, to protect immigrants, to protect people, to protect women. And I have a very simple rule on this. Anything or any policy that is going to give a foothold to hate anywhere in this country, we are going to oppose. Because I'll tell you what I fear is normalizing hate. And you allow it to take a foothold anywhere in any form, you're going to see the normalization of it. And we have to be acutely aware to it. You know, is this thing being filmed? Okay, that's good to know. then I'm not going to say what I was going to say. I think when you look at the rhetoric, that dehumanizes people in a false narrative about crime, about who is more likely to commit crime, it is incredibly dangerous, and we've seen it before in this country. And we gotta know and be aware of our history because we see it repeating itself right now. And we have to be vigilant, and we gotta be courageous. And it's not courageous, it's not me. It's gonna be you guys. It's gonna be you guys speaking up and demanding that we fight. Because if you don't, I'm not sure elected officials are always gonna be as responsive as we should be. It's gotta be you guys. We're gonna listen. You guys are the leaders on this, not us. I was reading a book about the prison industry the other day. And they were talking about how they'd feed breakfast, how inmates would have breakfast. And the phrase they used was morning feeding. And I was so struck by that language and what it implies. So I think we need to be incredibly sensitive to the rhetoric, to code words, to the language that's being used to really dehumanize people, to scapegoating folks, and to hold the line against hate in whatever form it may come. You know, we got 42 dreamers in the state of Vermont. And perhaps there's some here, I don't know. And we sued, joined a lawsuit to protect the dreamers. And I don't know who it was, but I was getting criticized by somebody. My response was very simple. If there was one dreamer in the state of Vermont, we're gonna sue and we're gonna fight for them. Because this is what this country is all about, the American dream. That these folks come to this country, that we've all come to this country. It's just a question of how far back do we wanna go to look in our own family history. For one simple reason, to live a better life, to give our children an opportunity for a better life. And that is what this country is based on. That it is why it's been a beacon of hope. That is why we are fighting every day, whether it's criminal justice reform, whether it's civil rights, whether it's immigration, for me to maintain the American dream that I believe in this country. I love this country. I said, we are the best country in the world. And somebody said, do you really believe that? I said, of course I do. Of course I do. But we gotta be mindful of our own history, our own personal history. And we gotta say to folks that we believe in them, that we're gonna create a system in this country, we're gonna create a world where people who come to this country, who through their hard work, through their innovation, through their creativity, they can truly be successful. And it's not how we define success. It may be success by their definition. But my kids, I look at my kids and I say this all the time. I get an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. And the 5-year-old's probably too young. And the 8-year-old's probably too young, but I'm a little crazy. I always say to them, I want you to do better than me. And I always say, you're already doing better than me. I said, I want you to do better than me. because that's what any parent wants. They want their kids to do better than them, or at least have an opportunity to do better than them. And the fact that this country would take away the idea of that opportunity to people based on their skin color or based on where they were born, I think is un-American. We're better than that, and we need to continue to preserve that ideal of what America is for so many people around this country.
Hi, I feel like one of the biggest challenges that we have right now in the criminal justice system is how evidence is used to convict people of color, or in general, many disadvantaged people. So what I want to ask you is specifically how in the state of Vermont do we intend to reform the way evidence is used? And when I say evidence, I'm talking about forensic evidence, for example, like sometimes DNA testing is used and the DNA is contaminated and that leads to false convictions. Other situations include witnesses not knowing which person actually committed the crime, and then they accidentally convict or they accidentally mention the wrong person based on physical similarities between people of color that they might not be able to distinguish. So I feel like with these many factors, many diverse factors, it all adds up and it leads to many people of color being put into situations that they otherwise might not be into. So how would you say, what is your opinion on that? How would we reform that?
It's a tough question. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, my initial reaction is, and I think this is a unfortunate trend, there's very few trials anymore in this state, criminal trials, which, look, you get into bail reform on that avenue as well too, frankly. So I don't know. I mean, look, you want a system that's transparent, that's reliable, that people can believe in, and obviously the vast majority of cases result in a plea agreement where people are making a knowing and voluntary plea. I can't say that, and I can only think of one case, and Bobby or Sarah can jump in on this, through the Innocence Project, or ANNA, where perhaps a conviction was overturned. Grega? Yeah, so I can only think of one case in our state. It's not to say it doesn't exist, but that's the only one I'm aware of.
I feel like that's like a nationwide issue, but I was just wondering in this state, what was the situation?
Look, we're not without our problems, but I think we've only had one case overturned. And I think you have to look again at the number. I mean, I gotta think it's like 99% of cases, I don't know if it's that high, result in a plea agreement, which is predicated on a knowing and voluntary plea of guilt by the defendant.
When you're talking about evidence-based information, I wonder, and you were giving us some statistics about recidivism. Have you been able to build up sufficient information to show that some of the pretrial diversions, et cetera, show an economic benefit,
Oh, yeah.
which might persuade some
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
who are
Absolutely.
otherwise
Yeah.
going the other way?
I mean, this is pennies on the dollar compared to incarceration, absolutely. And frankly, even on the recidivism, it works, it's much lower. And I think it's becoming much more standardized. And I think, one of the issues in our state, for a long time, it's still an issue, but it's not as much, was you had 14 different systems of justice based on our county system, which led to a lot of disparities. And I think you have much more uniformity and much more standardization. Diversion referrals are at an all-time high in our state. Everybody is using some sort of risk assessment tool. Everybody has access to pretrial monitoring, where cases are being diverted, where hopefully that reduces incarceration. So yes, and it's a fraction of the cost. I mean, incarceration costs a lot of money. And I've always felt one of the best arguments. And look, one of the biggest examples of why this is such a bipartisan, criminal justice reform is a bipartisan issue. I mean, you had President Trump talk about it in the State of the State, which I was happy to hear. But when I realized this was a real bipartisan issue, I was at a conference once, and the conference was sponsored by Van Jones. I don't know if you guys know who Van Jones is, and the Koch brothers, and like ACLU. And I was like, well, this is strange bedfellows to, but yeah, it's a fraction of the cost. And I think that's why you have such bipartisan support, because we're wasting not only a lot of dollars, we're wasting an enormous amount of human potential through this system. And I'm a firm believer, there's a lot of entrepreneurs in the criminal justice system. Give them an opportunity. They're gonna surprise us. Give people opportunity, they'll surprise us. Hey, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much all for the wonderful questions. We will be having a panel hosted by professors. So if you could just stick around, I know that a lot of the questions that you have right now, you will be able to ask them. But before we move forward, we would really, really like to thank our keynote speaker, Attorney General TJ Donovan. So thank you very much on the behalf of BALSA, on the behalf of our members and the VLS community. Thank you.